Like a fight with your wife, you may have thought it was all over, but we are not done yet. Marriage Part B. Let's talk some more about that. Coming up next on Sunday School. Hello, I'm Father Timothy Matkin, your instructor for Sunday School, and I'm glad you've joined us for this second talk about marriage. Before we get into that, if you would look down below and bless that like button, it would help us out greatly. Subscribe to the channel to see more of these videos, and consider sharing it on your timeline so your friends can learn more about the Christian faith. Also, you can look down into the show notes and find the link to the text for this lecture. And if you'd like to know more about all of these topics, you can go online and order the book from which they're taken, The Romance of Orthodoxy by Homer Rogers. Now, before we begin our study, we want to begin with a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, so let us pray. Prevent us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, obtain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we're going to talk more about marriage, and to begin, I'm going to start with two quotations that I will read to you. Quotation number 1, every person has a right to human fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship. Quotation number 2, love is the experience of knowing that another person cares deeply, warmly, acceptingly, and dependably. This is the most indispensable need of any human being, to which all other heart hungers are tributary, to have a steady source of warmth and affection to offset the chill of depersonalizing experiences in the outside world. Such love, given and received in marriage, feeds self-esteem. It reinforces a feeling of inner security by making the marriage a harbor where one is safe from many of the storms and threats of everyday life. Love is a force that welds a relationship at its point of meeting. The ancient insight of St. Paul has been confirmed and reconfirmed in the social sciences, counseling relationships, and successful marriage. The greatest of these is love. Well, how did those quotations sound to you? Is that the way you think about love? The first quotation that I read is a slogan in support of gay rights. The second is from the book The Intimate Marriage by Howard and Charlotte Kleinbell. He was a professor of theology at Claremont College in California, and she was a psychiatric social worker. And this quotation actually is not so much a description of love as it is of the experience of being loved. It is really what we might call romanticism, which is an illusion. But marriage is about grappling with reality. Let's talk about the history of Romanticism. About 2000 BC, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, society was agricultural. People farmed the land which surrounded the villages. It was a matrilineal, matriarchal society. Heritage came through the mother. The father's part was fairly insignificant. Their religion consisted in the worship of a goddess who personified the forces of nature. Her idol was a large statue of a woman whose belly was an open furnace. They worshipped her by throwing babies into its flames. They said that every year she died and was reborn again in the springtime. Persephone of the Greek myth is a version of her. Around 1500 BC, there was an invasion of patriarchal people into Greece and Italy. These Viking Indo-Europeans worshipped a masculine sky god. In Greece, that god was called Zeus. In Italy, Jove. The Hebrews knew God as Yahweh. They all thought of babies as the product of the father, and the mother was where they were formed, the incubator. The Hebrews were more careful about their wives because the father had to be sure it was his baby, not just hers. 1,000 years later, about 500 BC, in those places, fertility religions began to revive in the form of mystery religions or mystery cults, the first important revival of Christianity. The mystery religions were matriarchal, orgiastic, and anti-intellectual, and so I believe really gave way to more I feel. For its first 300 years, Christianity was an underground religion, but by AD 400, it was dominant throughout the Roman Empire, at least in the cities. But that old fertility religion survived in the waterfront slums and out in the countryside. In fact, the very word pagan itself comes from the Latin word pagus, which means the countryside. And so the hillbillies tended to remain pagan. 2 centuries later, in the 600s, the new religion of Islam swept throughout the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Islam was patriarchal and puritanical. But Puritanism is always vulnerable to its mirror, which is paganism. Islam also swept westward across North Africa, bringing along with it the surviving paganism of the eastern seaport slums. From there it spread up into Spain and to Europe. And that paganism combined with the rural paganism of the European countryside. As a result, between 900 and 1100 AD, strange things began happening all over Europe. There was, we might say, an outbreak of romanticism. Teenagers were sneaking out after dark to gather in the meadows and hold what they called courts of love. They would choose a maiden to be the queen of love, and the other maidens would serve as her ladies-in-waiting. They chose one of the boys to be her consort, and the other boys paired off with the girls. And then they performed intricate figure dances until they were all thoroughly excited. And finally, they engaged in sexual intercourse, and then just before dawn, they sneaked back home. And their parents felt helpless to stop or control it. And so now you know the origin of basically folk dances and square dances, as innocent as that seems today. It came to be called going courting. Homecoming queens and eventually beauty pageants can all be traced back to this custom. The Marian festivities, like the May Queen and the crowning ceremonies, are the Church's attempt to Christianize these folk rituals and infuse some virtue and chastity into these old customs which had corrupted virtue. In the springtime, teenage boys ran off from home and wandered around with guitars or lutes singing love songs, as long as the weather was bearable. And then in the winter, they would attach themselves to some estate until the weather was mild enough to hit the road again. And these teenage boys were called troubadours. Their songs were in the vulgar language, which was actually a broken-down form of Latin, the Roman language. Thus, the songs which the troubadours sang in that language were called romances. Their songs were scarcely more than translations of the ancient hymns to the fertility goddesses. The famous novel by Cervantes, Don Quixote, was written as a parody or criticism of Romanticism. But it miscarried, and the people took it seriously. The modern musical comedy Man of La Mancha was based on that, and the song from it, The Impossible Dream, became very popular. In the early 1800s, Romanticism was in full flower in Europe and America. Marriage was expected to produce romantic values, but it could not and cannot. Either all those romantic expectations had to be abandoned, or the institution of marriage would disintegrate. And that's exactly what happened, faster and faster, because people are clinging to the romantic illusion. Now, what are we talking about? Picture this. Deep in his heart, Johnny and Mary are romantics. At age 15, he's made for rapture. At 25, he'll settle for happiness. At 35, he'll settle for peace. And at 45, he really wants security. The Christian believes we are made for ecstasy, but knows that it comes in heaven. The romantic pagan believes it's available here on earth. Personal fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship. Our first quotation. The romantic pagan believes it's available on earth, but will be found somewhere else or with someone else rather than in heaven. When the man fails to find human fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship, he does not assume that what he was expecting was in any way unreasonable, but rather he assumes that he's just married the wrong person, and the woman usually has the same experience. Perhaps it was not love, perhaps it was some kind of case of mistaken identity. Well, we've been talking about marriage. Let's talk about love, beginning with Eros. Our hero in this little story is a 14-year-old boy, 6'3", 150 pounds, size 13 feet and pimples. And one thing he's certain of is that no girl in her right mind would look at him twice. In fact, he's kind of afraid of girls. But at the same time, he's also fascinated by them. In short, he is in awe of them. So one day after school, he finds himself walking along beside one of these girls, and she happens to say something about how dumb her parents are. And he says he knows exactly what she means because his parents are just as dumb. And they discover that each understands the other, really. One thing leads to another, and before long, he's sitting with her in the swing on her front porch. After an hour or so, he gets up the nerve to try to kiss her. He knows that she will just slap his face and send him home, but lo and behold, she kisses him back. And that night he walks home, his feet 6 inches off the ground. He is in love. In English, we have one word, which has to cover many different meanings. The Greeks had a word for each of them. Our word is love, and it can mean completely opposite things. For instance, we say things like, I love cheesecake, and believe me, I do, which means that I want to take the being of cheesecake, consume it, and use it to fulfill my emptiness. And this is the most frequent sense in which we use this word love. It's simply desire. I desire cheesecake. The technical name in the Greek is the word eros. That's where we get the word erotic. That's the kind of love that our 14-year-old boy hero is in. The girl is making him feel valuable and important and worth the time of day and understood. You know, psychotherapy has 3 stages. Stage 1, dependency, kind of like being in love with a therapist. Number 2, hostility, testing that reality. And number 3, friendship. Those are stages in psychotherapy. Being in love, like the boy and girl above, is really being like in mutual psychotherapy. Lovers' quarrels are really that reality testing. They start when the first hint appears that the other's love interest is really in what he's getting out of the relationship. And notice what they quarrel about are things like, well, you said so-and-so, or some other indication of inadequate motive. Marriages are destroyed by people expecting their spouses to be therapists. If you need therapy, you should go to a counselor. But unfortunately, today's marriage manuals usually try to tell you how to turn your marriage into successful psychotherapy. Therapy is not what marriage is for. It has a different purpose. Let's talk about a different kind of love. Well, one morning, 6 months after the wedding, at breakfast, Johnny looks across the breakfast table at Mary and smells the toast burning and says to himself, "My God, I'm married to that? Now I'm never going to find my dream girl, and it's all her fault." He has 3 choices. Number 1, leave her for someone else. Number 2, take a mistress. Number 3, try to be a satisfactory husband. If he chooses the third and says, I really blew it, but I made solemn promises, so I'll be the man and do what I said I would do. At that point, real love begins to enter the picture. So this brings us to the second kind of love, which is called agape. This is loving with the will, whether you feel like it or not. Love which is unmasked, undemanded, on which there's no price tag, is self-verifying. It does away with the need for reality testing. So it's important that both Johnny and Mary know that agape love is going to be involved in marriage, so they will not be suspicious when trouble comes along. Marriage is a 100% proposition. It's not a 50-50 kind of deal. Matthew 5:43-48 says, If you love those who love you, what reward have you? It continues, You must therefore be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. And what Jesus means is, I'll scratch your back if it itches. If mine itches, I'll rub it on the bedpost. When both Johnny and Mary are loving this way, each is getting an awful lot of love. Jesus says, where a man's treasure is, there will his heart be also. Matthew 6:21. That is the reason a woman loves her newborn baby. She's been inconvenienced and made uncomfortable by it. Thus, she's been investing herself in it for months before it's born. In fact, in John 16:21, Jesus says, She no longer remembers the anguish of childbirth, for the joy of a child being born in the world. When agape love is persisted in, it gives way to joy. But if you try to stay on the level of eros love or desire, even that will dry up. Agape love means drawing on the power of God to minister to my spouse. This is in a sense, opposite of eros love, which uses up my spouse for my own welfare. Eros does not teach me anything about the one I'm desiring. I only to see her or him in terms of my own need. I do not see her as she really is, or as she may become. In a sense, I do not really know her. But agape leads me to identify with her and become part of her, to invest myself in her. And when she rejoices, I rejoice. And when she is sad, I am sad. I dwell in her, and she dwells in me. Now, if that rings a bell, it should. This corresponds to the union between Christ and his bride, the church, as we pray in the Eucharist, that we may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of thy Son, Jesus Christ, be filled with thy grace and heavenly benediction, and made one body with him, that he may dwell in us and we in him. And of course, that comes straight out of John's Gospel. This identification with my spouse is the fulfillment of that desire and longing which we discovered in childhood, to grow up and experience what it's like to live as both man and woman together. Well, this brings us to another kind of love, a third kind, philia, a Greek word not to be confused with filial love, which comes from Latin and refers to something else, but philia, usually translated friendship, is actually a more profound notion than that would suggest. Jesus used the word at the Last Supper when he says, This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you, to love or agape one another. So agape leads to philia. Agape involves dying to one's self, and in a sense, rising to a new life in the beloved. The new life in the beloved is that philia. Husband and wife become united as friends, bonded in Jesus' sense of the word, friends. In fact, this is really the fulfillment of when he says in Matthew 19, the two become one flesh. Hebrews speaks of the way that Jesus laid down his life for his bride, the church, in these words from Hebrews chapter 12. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The philia, friendship, that comes out of agape love is also joy. The lover rejoices in the beloved. So perhaps philia should be better translated as joyful friendship. The Christian gospel is that we shall achieve the purposes for which we were made, that is, to know God, to love God, and to enjoy Him forever. So this is not a one-way relationship. We are also to be known, to be loved, and to be enjoyed. And when persisted in, holy matrimony leads to that kind of union between man and wife. They come to know and to be known, to love and to be loved, to enjoy and to be enjoyed. That union does not come without death to one's self. But that is, after all, what we should expect from St. Paul's words in his epistle to the Ephesians as he talks about marriage in chapter 5. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Holy matrimony, then, is a lifelong commitment to love, and to love without being able to run away from it. But everyone feels like doing that 1,000 times. Every natural affection has to die in order for God to replace it with supernatural joy, and that can involve pain. The cross cannot be escaped. Just as a child must surrender his broken toy if his daddy's going to take it and fix it, so every married couple has to accept the replacement of that first kind of love, eros, that desire for the other, with which marriage begins. But we do it for the joy set before us. Well, imagine, if you will, for a moment, a young fellow from Brooklyn who moves to Fort Worth, and he notices that the family next door has a kitchen garden full of all kinds of vegetables. And he thinks it would be nice if he had a garden like that. So he asks his neighbor how to go about starting a garden. His neighbor tells him the first thing he has to do is buy a garden hoe and go out there and break up all the ground. So he goes down to the hardware store and he asks for one. Now, since he grew up in Brooklyn, he doesn't know quite what it looks like. The clerk tells him they're standing in the corner of the garden section. But when our hero goes to get one, he mistakenly picks up a leaf rake instead. Because it's in the wrong place, he doesn't know what it's supposed to look like. Well, when he gets home with what he thinks is a hoe and tries to break up the ground with that, of course, obviously, it doesn't work. He's extremely frustrated and he calls up his neighbor to chew him out for giving him bad advice. When a person expects something from marriage, which marriage is not designed to produce, it disappoints the person, and one can get frustrated, angry, and bitter. He or she looks for someone to blame, and the one who gets blamed is usually the person's partner. When two people get married, often each one is expecting the other to make them happy. However, since Johnny is waiting to be made happy, his attention is not on his real job, which is to minister to Mary's happiness. And likewise, Mary is waiting for Johnny to make her happy instead of serving his well-being. And we're led to expect the wrong thing out of marriage. You know, there's a false dogma that we've learned at our mother's knees. That false dogma is that the basic unit of society is the individual. The truth is that the family is the basic unity or unit of society. The basic unit of water is not hydrogen, nor is it oxygen. The basic unit of water is that H2O molecule, which includes both hydrogen and oxygen. And so, in the same way, the family is the creature of God, just as truly water is God's creature. It's impossible to be really human outside the human community. When fallen human beings are born, they don't know how to be human. It's through the institutions of society that individuals learn what it is to be human and also have the opportunity to practice. Any community which exists only for the benefit or happiness of its individual members contains the seeds of its own destruction, and sooner or later it will self-destruct and disintegrate. Think of petty dictatorships. The biblical symbol of this principle is the story of the Tower of Babel. Of course, we're all sinners, we're all self-centered, and sooner or later what you want conflicts with what I want. At that moment, our community seems to be a failure. In fact, for that moment, it is a failure, if my happiness or benefit is the community's only reason for existing. Therefore, the family must have a purpose outside of itself, which the members all agree is more important than their own desires or goals. There is such a purpose, and it has three levels: the natural, the moral, and the spiritual. So in natural terms, the purpose of marriage is to make a family, a community, in which the values of the gospel can become a fact, and in which children can be raised up to become saints, not just adults, but holy people. In moral terms, the purpose of family is to be that school of discipline. It's not good to live alone, because then one always can have his own way, and that results in a person becoming spoiled. But when two people are locked together for life, and they cannot run away from each other or their disagreements, someone has to give in, there has to be some give and take, and all of us have to learn how to do those things sooner or later. If, for example, two singles living together cannot agree on the color of the new curtains, they can just split up and go their own way. When people get married, they promise never to do that. When a couple gets married, they take a vow which expresses their agreement to accept the discipline of marriage for life. I, John, being of age and sound mind, all appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, take thee, Mary, to my wedded wife, knowing full well that you may have many disgusting personal habits, and this is going to cost me all my freedom and more money than I can earn. Nevertheless, knowing that it will make a man out of me like nothing else can, not even the Marine Corps, I, John, take thee, Mary, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, to give in to and to put up with and to make excuses for, till death do us part, come hell or high water or in-laws, so help me God, which I desperately need, and thereto I plight thee my troth. Well, marriage is designed to turn boys and girls into men and women. There's an irony involved. The irony is no one is really ready for marriage until he or she is mature. But no one is likely to become mature, really, outside of marriage, or its moral equivalent, which is a strong community like military service or a religious order. St. Benedict of Nursia, who founded Western monasticism in the 6th century, said, "If men will live without women, they must not live alone." So his monastic rule makes the religious order a kind of synthetic family, and it builds in the same kind of disciplines that a family has. For example, at night, after the baby has gone to sleep, everybody in the family tries to be quiet so they won't wake him up. In a Benedictine monastery, from Compline at night until after Mass the next morning, nobody speaks. This is called the Great Silence. In a natural family, sometimes the baby does wake in the middle of the night and has to be changed or fed. So that the monks won't miss out on having a baby in the family, they get up in the middle of the night and spend a few minutes in the chapel praying matins together. The 4 vows which govern monastic life also apply to marriage. They are stability in place. Each Benedictine monk promises to spend the rest of his life not just as a monk, but at that particular monastery. That is to say, we are not going to split when things get rough. And then the vow of poverty. Each monk renounces private ownership of property, leaving belongings to the community. That's the same reason why Daddy doesn't have the right to buy a pack of cigarettes for himself until he's sure that the kids have their lunch money. And then the vow of chastity. In marriage, it means my sexuality, in a sense, does not belong to me, but under God it belongs to my spouse. The purpose of my sexuality, as far as pleasure is concerned, is to give pleasure to my spouse. If I get that backward and exploit her for my own pleasure, I will depersonalize her, and then I will feel guilty about it, and then I will project my guilt onto her. So we pledge chastity, living out our sexuality under God's design. And then that vow of obedience. Every member undertakes to put his own interest after that of the community. For example, once upon a time, a woman who was an accomplished linguist with several advanced degrees joined a religious order. The first job she was given was washing dishes. It happened that the order needed to have some dishes washed. At that time, it did not happen to need a linguist. Now later on it did, and then she was given the opportunity to use her talents. But first, her task was just washing dishes. The principles expressed by those 4 vows are basic to holy matrimony, and they enable it to function as the school of sanctifying discipline, which all of us desperately need. The spiritual purpose of holy matrimony is to be a sign. The spiritual purpose is to be a sign. Sexuality is a given fact of God's creation. The whole creation is male and female from top to bottom. Why? Did God foul up? It seems a bit inefficient. Wouldn't it be better if we were all just interchangeable? Some people today think we are. Why did God do it this way? Because of the incredible fact that God has taken to himself a bride, you, me, all of creation. This runs through the Bible from beginning to end. The church is the bride of Christ, the body of the groom. Man comes into this world by way of the body of a woman. Jesus, the groom himself, becomes man in the womb of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Bible ends with the vision of the bride adorned for her husband, and she is the one who speaks the invitation to all to come and enter into the joy of heaven. The marriage of man and woman is a sign, a revelation of God's purpose in creation. The kingdom of heaven is like a wedding feast, and we are being brought in through this world, through the kitchen, as it were, to whet our appetites for God, not necessarily to satisfy them in the here and now. In heaven there is no marrying or giving in marriage, because in heaven each of us will be married, not only to our earthly spouse, but also, in a sense, to everybody else, and all of us to God. Basically, the purpose of holy matrimony is to get us ready for something far more grand, for heaven. St. Paul says in Ephesians 5, "Always and for everything give thanks in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God the Father. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Well, of course, God is creator. Man is made in God's image, and so all human beings are creative. And the most creative thing anyone can do is have a child. By the time the baby is born, the mother has thoroughly identified with the child. When the baby is born, the center of the mother's attention shifts from her husband completely to her baby, and it needs to do so. The mother needs to be protected from danger and freed from having to be concerned about the family's relationship to the larger community, as distinct from social contact with friends. So the emphasis of the husband's love needs to be in making her secure, in giving her the assurance that he will always be there. In this way, he enables her to be herself. St. Paul's injunction, "Husbands, love your wives," means for them to demonstrate their affection frequently every day, day in, day out, with kisses and embraces and so on. Men have a problem which women usually don't have. It's hard for men to maintain a sense of their manhood. On the other hand, a woman has her baby for years and years to tell her she's a mother, and even her physiology reinforces her sense of being a creator, of her womanhood. However, men's babies live but for a moment of time and die. For example, like me, after I've preached a sermon, I have to start getting ready to do it all over again next Sunday. And no matter how well I may have done it last Sunday, there's always the question, can I do it again? Actors and comedians notoriously suffer from this kind of anxiety, but in a sense, all men do. Men are also in competition with other men. Every time a man loses in that competition, it's a blow to his self-esteem, to his sense of being adequate. For example, when a husband is laid off, even because of a recession or something through no fault of his own, it still demoralizes him. The longer his unemployment lasts, the worse it gets, and the harder it is for him to believe that he can ever hold a job again. Wives, then, need to make their husbands feel like the men they are. A man needs to feel like he's a conquering hero in the eyes of his family. By being a husband, a man is a candidate for combat. It is his duty to be ready and willing to die for his wife, even as Christ laid down his life for his bride, the church. Thus, for example, when there's a strange noise in the middle of the night, it's his duty to get up and go investigate. Therefore, Paul says, let the wife see that she reverences or reveres her husband. Let the wife do for him and his family, and let the husband do things for her and her family. The Christian family is also a hierarchy. The husband is the head of the wife and the family, even as Christ is the head of the church, Paul says. And he must bear that authority in the same way that Christ did. So the husband is the prophet of the family. He's responsible for the intellectual and cultural life of the family and for its moral standards. In his absence, the wife carries that responsibility. The husband is the priest of the family. He's responsible for its spiritual life, its worship, and its prayers. He is the one who says the blessing at meals, not the children. In this way, the children learn that it is grown-up business, which they will get to do when they grow up, rather than child's play, which they're going to outgrow. He's responsible for the family's stewardship of the things which God has entrusted to it. At night, he gives his children his blessing, as well as when they're sick. And by the way, a lot of men, husbands, fathers, don't know this. You are sort of like the priest of your family. You can bless the members of your family. Just do it the same way the priest does in church. He can lay his hand on their heads and say, "May God bless you." This custom goes back nearly 4,000 years to the Hebrew patriarchs. In the father's absence, the wife is responsible for these things. And when he reaches puberty, the oldest son begins to share some of these responsibilities in his father's absence. The husband also, following the role of Christ, is the king of the family. The husband rules in the same way that Christ did, by being the standard, the rule, the measure. He is to be the servant of the family, and like Christ, ready even to lay down his life for his family when necessary. Well, now, let's talk about sex. Some anthropologists say that all religion is based on sex. However, the reverse is probably closer to the truth, that sex is based on religion. You have probably heard it said that prostitution is the oldest profession, but it isn't. The priesthood is. Adam, before the fall, was the priest of all creation. Prostitution, needless to say, came after the fall. The oldest artifacts in the world are small figurines like the Venus of Willendorf. They're females with large breasts and hips and usually depicted pregnant. They date from as early as 35,000 BC, and they come from all over the world. Throughout the history of the human race, sex has been held in awe. Today, we do not hold it in awe, but we definitely are preoccupied with it, perhaps as never before, because it is in such disorder. The return of Romanticism has not liberated us from preoccupation with sex. It has intensified that preoccupation. Romanticism is at bottom the worship of that great Mother Earth. And it's no accident that along with Romanticism has come the widespread practice of abortion. For the great Mother Earth, remember, in ancient times was always worshipped with infant sacrifice. Abortion is the sacrifice of the unborn child for the sake of the supposed well-being of the family or society at large, even the well-being of the overpopulated Mother Earth. Well, there are two false dogmas about sex which are at war with each other in our society and often within the members of our society. The first is the false dogma that sex is nasty or dirty. So we speak of dirty jokes, not of sexy jokes. The ancient pagans believed that sex was basic and therefore taboo. To violate taboo was to bring a curse upon oneself. And Christians believe sex is a sacrament. And to abuse a sacrament is a sacrilege. That is, the reason that illicit sex is bad. It's because it's illicit, not because it's sex. But the Puritans, after the Reformation, denied the reality of all sacraments. Nevertheless, they still had the habit of considering illicit sex to be bad and problematic. They had abandoned the old basis for that attitude, so all that was left was to blame the badness on the sexiness of sex. It is characteristic of Puritanism to call the things of God's creation evil, even though He calls them good. Remember, the Puritan motto is, if it's fun, don't do it. Let me remind you of the distinction between natural good and moral good. They're not always the same. For example, it is a natural good to be able to run fast. But the circumstances under which one is running determines whether it's morally good or not in that particular case. Why is he running? From what or to what is he running? Natural evil is the privation of a natural good. Moral evil is to prefer the less good or the absence of good over the greater good. Sex, well done, is a natural good. Clumsily done is a less natural good. Brutally done is a natural evil. The second false dogma is that sex is merely a natural bodily appetite, which must be gratified. This false dogma is a reaction against the Puritanism of the 17th and 16th and early 18th centuries. The rationalists of the 18th century, that age of enlightenment, decided that sex was not evil, but it couldn't be holy because they didn't believe in holiness. So it must be just another bodily, natural appetite which has to be satisfied, like eating when you're hungry. However, unlike the appetite for food, not having sex doesn't kill you. It doesn't shorten your life or make you sick. The truth about sex is that it's neither nasty nor simply and only just natural. Sex is holy. Sex is sacramental, a moment in space and time in which we are brought into close relation with God. Sex is obviously sacramental for the following reason. In the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, God uses human agents to accomplish rebirth and then the nourishment of that new life. When the sperm unites with the ovum, an immortal soul comes into being, made by God. God does this through the agency of a mother and father. The sexual relationship is the most intimate relationship between the father and the mother and between them and God. So sex is powerful, and that means sex is also, in a sense, dangerous. Because sex is a sacrament, it's not something to be played with. It's not something to be abused. Sacraments always have an effect, for good or ill. And so St. Paul says of the Holy Eucharist, quote, "Whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. Anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment or damnation upon himself." That's 1 Corinthians 11, 21 and 29. The same principle applies to every act of sexual intercourse. The two participants are never left unchanged by the interaction. There are always spiritual and moral consequences to every act of sexual intercourse. The abuse of sex always leads to the debasing of the participants. Sex outside of marriage is evil, not because it's sexy, but because it is the choice of a lesser good instead of a greater good. The greater good is marital and family solidarity. Among the Hebrews, marital infidelity was referred to in the same way as infidelity to the Lord. And both kinds of adultery were punished in the same way, adultery and idolatry, execution by stoning. Furthermore, sex outside of marriage is sinful because it's irresponsible, and in two ways. It's irresponsible, first, because sexual intercourse tends to make babies who are entitled to a stable home environment with the two parents who are loving to each other and to the children. And also, it's irresponsible because sexual intercourse is the most profound way of affirming the worth of the other person. It says, "I love you," or else it says, "I want to use you." Sexual arousal happens in the mind, not so much in the body. Sex does not interest a person who is involved in something fascinating or more important. For example, imagine a man fishing for trout in a mountain stream, and he thinks there's a big one just about to strike. Suddenly, Miss America steps out of the bushes without a stitch on. What does he do? He says, "Shh, I've almost got this one." Sexual temptation is frequently the result of boredom. For example, imagine a young couple who've been seeing each other for some time, and if you can imagine it, they have not been sleeping together yet, but they have done everything else that might be of interest. One night, Johnny says to Mary, "You want to go to the movies?" Mary says, "Not really." And Johnny says, "You want to go bowling?" Mary says, "Not really." "I know, let's go for a drive." And Johnny says, "I don't really want to." Well, all the possibilities have been exhausted, and they're with each other, with the evening to themselves. There's always one more possibility. Sexual desire gets turned off in the head also. For example, imagine a boy and girl in the living room of the girl's home about 10 o'clock at night with all the lights off, and they've been passionately necking for about 15 minutes, and suddenly the lights go on. The girl's mother is standing there in the doorway, and she says, "Susie, don't you think it's about time you came to bed and let that nice young man go home?" Well, where's all the arousal gone now? The preoccupation with sex in our society is a sign of our society's spiritual poverty. We want more and more sex because we have so little really good sex. We're preoccupied with sex because we're bored with life, not because we have so much of a great interest in love. To illustrate, Father Rogers says, back when I was in college, I belonged to a fraternity. Every evening just before supper, several of us would walk down to the corner for a beer. One night, I had one more beer on my empty stomach, or I had more than one beer on my empty stomach. When we got back to the fraternity house, I discovered we were having one of my favorite dishes for supper, rice and gravy. I don't know why he likes that so much. But he says, I couldn't taste it. I had 3 servings trying to taste it. I knew it must be delicious. It's my favorite. If only I could taste it. When the frequency of sex slows down, it's common for a newly married person to get worried and wonder if something is wrong. Who's he doing it with? Who's she out there seeing? But maybe nothing's wrong. There's an old proverb which says that if you put an English pea in a milk bottle every time you have sex during the first year and take one out every time thereafter, you will never empty the bottle. Now that's probably a bit of an overstatement, but there might be some truth in that. There's no certain amount of sex which is normal. It all kind of depends on the circumstances and the people. Good sex, of course, takes good time and energy, and woman with children is likely to be tired at night, and a good mother may simply be content. The ready availability of sex tends to take the edge off the desire for it. For example, after a big meal, a man does not fantasize about having another steak, but a starving man definitely will. In the Middle Ages, because circumstances discouraged sexual intercourse, because of the availability and the practical nature of things, books on pastoral care used to tell priests to be sure to remind their people to have sex. Many people find sex overrated and disappointing because it's not handled right and done well, or because both people are more invested in receiving, perhaps, than in giving. It's devastating to have someone who has told you that he loves you to turn around and say that he really does not love you after all. We all know that it is easier to start a love affair than to end one. Therefore, only say, I love you, when and if you really mean it. And only start having sex with someone if you intend to keep on doing it with that person for the rest of your life and you are in a position to carry out that commitment. And that's what we call marriage. The thing that's wrong with fornication, by the way, that's not a common word anymore. It means having sex outside of marriage when you're not married. The thing that's wrong with fornication is not the starting of it so much as the stopping of it. This is the reason why the church has recognized common law marriages or natural marriages. So Christians take their proposed relationship to the church and ask for her to have a blessing upon it, upon what they're going to do, and then they go home and do it. And so in a sense, they really get married in bed. That's what we call the consummation of the marriage. Marriage is essentially constituted by that union of the body. Therefore, every time a husband and wife have sex, they reconstitute their marriage. They fulfill their vows, just like every Eucharist reconstitutes the church. Well, one more thing about this. Sex establishes a bond of commitment to mutual respect and responsibility, and it's a sign of the mystical union between Christ and his body, the church. Well, thank you for joining us for this session on marriage. Next week, we'll have the final session, which will be on prayer and the precepts of the church. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you will again. If you'd like to come join us for worship in person, you can look us up and learn all about us at stfrancisdallas.org. Please like and share, and we will see you there. God bless.